President, is there time under control of anyone?
There is no
Mr. President,
time control at this time.
I will not take much time. I rise in support of, as a co-sponsor of the Dole Amendment on Bosnia. Mr. President, I know this body is tired over the last year. I shouldn't say I know. I expect you might be tired of hearing me speak so many times to this issue. Mr. President, the distinguished chairman of the Finance Committee and genuinely an expert on foreign policy, and no one knows more about ethnicity and its impact on international events and domestic events in other countries than the senator from New York, chairman of the Finance Committee, spoke, and he asked a number of questions. Does this mean the war will spread? Does this mean? He asked 4 questions. I'll presumptuously answer them all. The answer is yes, 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 yes. There's nothing good that comes from our continued inaction and paralysis. Nothing good for the United States. Nothing good for world peace. I stood on this floor about a year ago asking for the embargo to be lifted. I stood on this floor 8 months ago, 6 months ago, 4 months ago, asking for the embargo to be lifted. I also might tell you very bluntly, I think we should also be using air power. I think we should have been using it a year ago, a year and a half ago. I think that, and each time I heard the same arguments that I'm hearing here today when I hear arguments against this proposition. Too late, doesn't work, beyond our control. Wrong then, wrong 18 months ago, wrong 12 months ago, wrong 8 months ago, wrong 6 months ago, wrong 4 months ago, wrong now. And I would respectfully ask unanimous consent, and I've done this only on 2 other occasions in 21 years, that a report that I wrote on my trip to Bosnia, to Sarajevo, to Tuzla, to Croatia, to Bosnia-Herzegovina, be entered in the record. And the reason I'm doing it, I ask unanimous consent that that be the case.
Without objection.
And the reason I'm doing it is to make a very simple point for anyone who bothered to read it. What was said then was true then. What was predicted then has occurred now. And what has not occurred yet that is predicted in this report, I will bet my political career on, will occur. Our failure as a nation to exert leadership over the Western alliance to deal with the situation in Bosnia has resulted in an exacerbation of the crisis in the identity and the rationale for NATO, has diminished the possibility and prospects for the United Nations taking on a new role in a new world order to bring about a change in world politics for the next 2 decades, if not the next 2 generations. And all we're asking here is for a simple, simple proposition. How in God's name can we argue against lifting the embargo? For God's sake, we put the embargo on the name of diminishing bloodshed. Do I need to make the point any more than to submit for the record the total number of casualties that have occurred in Bosnia-Herzegovina since we put the embargo on? What in the devil could have happened more? The perverse British and French argument that if we lift the embargo, we're going to perpetuate the bloodshed. They're idiots. And we're acting collectively as the free world like cowards. We stood on the floor 18 months ago. In this report several months ago, and a lot of times in between, and said Yugoslav forces are fighting in Bosnia, sent across the Drina by Milosevic against the Bosnian government. And we're told it didn't happen. Then 3 months later, they acknowledged it happened. At one point, Milosevic even acknowledged he was doing it. When the United States put pressure on that they might lift and strike, lift the embargo and use airstrikes. He even went so far as to say he'd allow international observers to stand on every bridge along the Drina River to check the cargo going across, whether or not fuel, ammunition, troops were being sent. Everybody said progress. The man wants peace. The moment after we withdrew the pressure, he withdrew the offer. This guy's a thug, a war criminal. And what's going on is an atrocity that rivals not in its scope, but rivals in its intensity the atrocities that took place in Central Europe in the 30s. Mr. President, it's truly a shame what we're allowing to happen. It's absolutely an outrage. I remember standing on this floor over the last year, arguing with my good friends, particularly on the Republican side, about the use of air power. They said, oh, it wouldn't be work, couldn't use, da-da-da-da-da, and then finally everybody, well, yeah, we could have used air power. It does have efficacy. It can work to knock out the heavy artillery sitting up in the mountains around Sarajevo, while in the summer, the Serbs, irregulars and regulars, sip their wine and eat their cheese and drop in one big howitzer shell after another to randomly fire at populations of children, elderly, women, hospitals, drinking fountains, water resource centers. I stood there in the streets of Sarajevo in a flak jacket and a helmet, being told to walk out of the way because right there at the water distribution center 3 days earlier, 17 women and children had been blown to bits by a shell fired from the mountains. And it had only just begun. I feel so strongly about this issue. To tell you the truth, some of my political advisors tell me not to speak to it because I say things that they say will be imprudent about us as a nation, about our allies as allies, and about the legacy we're going to leave for my sons and daughters' generation. Mark my words, I won't be around here, so it's easy to say it because I'll be gone. 20 years from now, they'll be debating on the floor of the Senate about a similar situation occurring, and they'll ask the same question that John Kerry and Joe Biden's generation asked of our father's generation. They say, how could guys like Vandenberg and others stood on the floor of the Senate in the 30s, knowing what was going on in Central Europe, and had done nothing? How could they do that? They'll teach it in school, just like they taught our generation. Just like these young pages learn in their history books about World War II. Everybody sits today who looks at that era and is incredulous. How could we have not known? How could we have not acted? How could it have been? It's so clear. Well, I never understood it till this issue came up. I now understand it. The American people back then didn't want to be involved unless you could paint for them a scenario where there was no cost. Period. No cost. And no senator or sufficient group of senators or congresspersons wanted to stand up and talk to the American people about the fact that Americans would lose their lives. You know how you young pages here in your history books about, had we acted, when Hitler began to mobilize and started flying those glider airplanes, you know, and practicing back in 34 and 35 and 36, and had we acted when he did, we would have been able to save the world. Truth is, had we acted then, Americans would have died. Now, granted, probably 1/100th as many, 1/1000th as many as died in World War II. Had we acted then, Frenchmen would have died. Englishmen would have died. People would have been killed, a small number, stopping Hitler in 1934. When it became clear to the people who knew better in the world that Hitler was running concentration camps in the late 30s, we could have stopped it. There still would have been maybe 800,000 Jews that had died. There would have been Americans that would have died in larger numbers than would have occurred in 34 had we acted. But they would have died. Had we acted 2 years ago on this issue, it's possible a couple Americans, literally a couple, a handful, may have died, which is an important thing. I don't take it lightly. Had we acted a year ago, maybe 24 Americans would have died. We act now, and we're not even asking, the Senate's not even asking what I'm asking. Were we to act, more than a handful will die. It's a harder problem, more intractable now. But I want to tell you, I believe with every fiber in my being, if we don't at least let what's left of the Bosnian government, which admittedly now is almost all Muslim. By the way, a year ago when I stood on the floor with the senator from Arizona and the senator from Massachusetts, it really was a multi-ethnic government, for real. Bosnian army was made up about 18% Bosnian Croats. It was made up about 22, if I'm not mistaken, percent Serbian, Bosnians of Serbian extraction, and the rest Muslim. It really was a multi-ethnic government and army. It's not now. People say, well, you know, everybody's an equal malfeasor over there. I try to explain to people, and I'm going to say it here for the record, and I will only take a couple more minutes, that Vance Owen peace plan was an atrocity for a simple reason. We sent a signal to every ethnic group in Bosnia and the surrounding areas that here's what we're going to do, folks. We, the world, are going to carve up this nation into ethnic enclaves. And the way we know that's going to end up, whether this piece of real estate is Serbian, and this piece of real estate is Muslim, and this piece of real estate is Croatian, depends on, like musical chairs, where you are standing when the music stops. The reason I bothered to point that out, you know why the Serbs and the Croats and the Muslims started going after one another about 8 months ago in earnest? Because they knew the world was walking away. They had been moved out, all the Croats may have been moved out of this area by the Serbs. But you had Muslims that filtered into that area. And some point along the way, the world's going to stop the music here. And they knew if we don't have a place in which to stand, it's going to be given to whoever's standing there. And so, as a Croat in Bosnia, it's easier for me to move out a Muslim than it is a Serb. Because the Serbs are being backed up by the Yugoslav army, funded by, equipped by the Serbian government. So, you had Serbs in Bosnia, former allies of the Muslims in Bosnia, moving the Muslims. The Muslims. They turned against the Croats. For what reason? They knew that nothing's left for them, and the one force that is the perpetrator of the problem, the Serbs, was too big to move. And then guess what happened? Everybody, including me, underestimated the absolute tenacity and absolute heroic stature of the Muslims in Bosnians first, Muslims second, in Sarajevo and other cities. After merciless pounding, the only analogy I can think of was what happened to the Brits during the Blitz. What happened to the Brits during the Blitz? They got tougher. They didn't crack. They got fortified. And guess what happened now? Now, the Muslims, unequipped, ill-equipped, with the whole world letting them go, they're starting to make some gains because there's more of them with an embargo on them. Well, guess what happens then? There used to be a song when I was a kid with a refrain, and it said, and then along came Jones. Muslims start making effectively with sticks and single-shot rifles come along, and they start to beat these Serbs. They start to make gains. Guess what happens? In comes the Serbian army again. Read the headlines in the paper. Milosevic crosses the Drina again. And what do? We keep the embargo on. Why do we keep the embargo on? Well, we keep the embargo on because we don't want to offend our European allies. I say to our European allies, so what? So what? What the devil use is NATO? And I have been an absolutely ardent, consistent, vehement supporter of NATO for its military as well as its political and economic reasons for 21 years in the United States Senate. But if it can't affect the carnage in the middle of Europe, what do we need it for? The Russians? So, the answer that we don't want to offend our NATO allies, I say, the hell with them. I said that before. They got angry with it. But I say it again. What's the other rationale for not lifting the embargo? We will spread the carnage. As the foreign minister of Bosnia said to me, a guy named Salajic, I asked a bunch of senators to come in 8 months ago, and I was trying to convince some of you to change your position. I didn't have to convince anybody, my friend from Arizona, this. He convinced me. Convinced others to change their view on what we should do. One of our colleagues sat in my conference room. There were 10 or 12 of us. I think the senator from Arizona was there. Salajic was there. And one of them said, you know, if we lift the embargo and you start getting sophisticated weapons and other things, first of all, you don't know how to use them. He pointed out there's universal conscripts in that area, in that country for the last 30 years, but that didn't seem to faze anybody. And now, by the way, if you notice, even our military guys are saying, you know, these guys are pretty good. They know how to use this equipment, these Muslims who are being driven underground. And they weren't all Muslims then. And he said, but if in fact we lift the embargo, we're just going to cause more people to be killed. And I'll never forget Salajic's answer to that particular senator. He looked him square in the eye and he said, Senator, my children, my family, literally and figuratively in a national sense, is being killed and maimed now. At least give me the dignity to choose to die the way I want to die. And Senator, even if you are right, I would rather die fighting than die sitting. Let's let them die their own way if we don't have the courage to help them live. Let them choose. Who are we to sit here and say, oh my God, we're not going to let you have weapons when they have weapons, because if you have weapons, more people will die. It's a bizarre argument that has an incredible, to me, resonance in this town and in the capitals of Europe. Well, I promised myself I wouldn't let myself get upset about this because I know what's going to happen here. But, so let me stop, conclude with a sentence saying, we're all going to be judged by this. You won't be judged now. Your constituents will like it better, probably, if you vote against Dole and Biden and DeConcini and others who share this view, who've shared this view for a long time. They'll like it better because they're going to be less involved. So, this is not a tough political vote. You're not going to pay any political price. And even if you vote for this, you're not going to pay much of a political price because we're not going to have the courage to really do anything in the end, probably. But I'll make you bet. I'll make you bet 4 years, 6 years, 8 years, 10 years down the road, if we cross paths outside this body and you're honest, you will acknowledge this is a vote you regretted. Now, that's easy for me to say because where my position, and I thought I had the president convinced. When I came back, I wrote this report, went down to the White House, gave it to him, sat with him for hours, sat with the Secretary of State. 3 days later, he came out and called for a policy of lift and strike, which I proposed in this legislation. I really thought that I had actually, one of the few times in my career in the Senate, actually affected events. So the truth of the matter is, maybe had he stuck with what I proposed and others, maybe it'd be worse for the United States of America. Who knows? I may be wrong. So it's easy for me to sit here and say what I've just said. But I'll promise you, 10 years from now, if we continue to do nothing and you were part of not putting pressure on the administration to do something, at least to lift the embargo, it will be a vote that the pages sitting on that step 10 years from now, you will not go down to them and say, you know, 10 years ago when I was a junior senator or a less senior senator, I cast a vote in this floor against lifting the embargo in a place called Bosnia. And they're going to look at you, oh, you mean that place where that larger war broke out back there and all those people died and were killed? Let's at least have the decency to paraphrase the foreign minister of Bosnia. Let them choose the way they want to die. At least let them have that right. Let's lift the embargo.
Madam President. Madam President.
Senator from Arizona.
Madam President.
Madam President, if I could just
be glad to yield to the senator from Massachusetts.
The senator.